split the time because I wanted to share, I was asked to talk some about human trafficking and migration, but I also want to talk about the reality right now at the border as advocates for migration and what are some of the challenges we face. So I'm going to attempt to split my time. And so, I mean, maybe, well, since I already said we have to hear things 30 times, if you've already heard this, what does it mean to be migrant-centered, right? All right, I can't do that with my glasses on. So migrant-centered advocacy, as it says, prioritizes the rights, the needs, and the voices of migrants, focusing on human rights and advocating for the policies that ensure dignity and well-being. What does this look like for us? First of all, it means I don't read a bunch of books and then say, this is what we should be doing, right? I'm sitting down with the people that we're serving. I'm listening to the needs of the people we're serving. Key principles, human rights. We're working for dignity and respect, empowerment of the people we're working with, and recognizing that there's what's called an intersectionality. In general, it's not, that person in front of me isn't a migrant. They're a migrant who might happen to be Honduran and might happen to be a woman or a mother or a man or gay and all of these pieces are going to affect how that person responds to what's going on. So we're always trying to really hear that person in front of us, right? Which is, of course, a lot of what we read about, like we don't talk about numbers, right? We talk about people and we talk about individuals because every individual is different. I can tell you as a long-term missioner overseas, people would say, you know, oh, Brazilians think this. And I would say, well, there's like 200 and something million of them. And they have different ideas. And we all fall into those habits. It's just, I think, to be aware of that. So I didn't put all my notes here because I don't want you guys reading all the time. But it's a constant evaluation of the signs of the times. Right? What I was doing a year ago is very different than what I'm doing right now. And unfortunately, or fortunately, very different than probably what I'll be doing tomorrow. And so it's really evaluating the signs of the times, adapting to the reality. Las Americas is an organization that does advocacy mostly here in El Paso. When the Remain in Mexico program, the Migrant Protection Protocols program started, we developed a team that was over in Juarez because we needed to have a team of people for all the migrants that were stuck across the border. When CBP1, the app started that people had to fill out to try to ask for asylum, our team switched and they started meeting with people and helping them use their phones to fill out the app. So it's really adapting to what the need is right now and not like coming at it with, well, this is what we do, right? And right now that might be, as Alon talked about, as Maria talked about, like the raids, the roundups, how are we working with people in this community? At one point, our team at Las Americas who did deportation defense, like people in deportation centers, was constantly working with people that had just arrived, asked for asylum, were detained for some reason, and we were trying to help them get out on bond. There's not that many people just arriving now. So we're working sometimes with people that may have lived there 10 years, here 10 years or 20 years, and just got scooped up and are in detention. And so we might be trying to help them get out of detention. It's a different level responding to what the need is right now. You know, in our office, we're like, do we have people come in if we need to do like an intake to see what they need, or do we not ask them to come to the office because they might be at risk on their way in or at the door of our office? It's exhausting because there's also this constant evaluation of what should we be doing and what's right and what's safe and what's appropriate, you know, and what's our capacity. And so, and then how do we advise people? And so these are, so like, do we use the phone, you know? Do we give people rides in our cars? I mean, when before I would get somebody out on bond, we'd go to the detention center and pick them up, right? And we'd drive them to the shelter. We don't do that anymore, you know? Knowing, and then I think lastly, it's always about thinking, what are all the options? What do they look like? and then letting the person in front of me make the decision, you know, because I'm not the one that's going to be deported. I'm not the one at risk of being deported. Well, not yet anyway. So I don't want to be the one making a decision. You know, I'm going to give an opinion that's closer to expert than theirs, or knows more, I would say, than theirs, but always making sure it's the person that I'm working with that decides what they want to do, you know. And I think Maria touched on some of that same idea of working with people. And so, I don't know where I put. Okay, so today's reality, just to give a quick, I know I do have some signs of hope at the end, so Hank, don't fall asleep at the end. You know, what is today's reality? So just some of the people we're working with. There's a young man who is part of our community and has been volunteering in our community. And I would ask you guys, if you use these, not to use the pictures of the people. Also, you guys online, if you're taking screenshots, not to reproduce the pictures of the clients that are on this slide. The info is fine. Thanks. So he was a member of our community. He has temporary protected status as a Venezuelan. And he went to his ICE check-in, because a lot of people have to show up at ICE once in a while, sign a piece of paper, and then go back home for 6 months or 4 months or 2 months or whatever. He went to his ICE check-in and they detained him. And so we looked up the statute, and the statute clearly says if you have TPS, temporary protected status, you cannot be deported, even if you have an order of removal. You can't be deported, and you can't be detained for immigration reasons. Like if I go off and murder someone, I could be detained for that, but I can't be detained because of anything related to my immigration status. He's been in detention a month. And like every day we sent copies of the statute to them again, just in case you didn't read it. So like last weekend, over the weekend, you know, our team was trying to file what's called a habeas corpus with federal court to get them to recognize that he's illegally being held and release him. Those are some of the shifts. Last year, I think Jen said we did 6 the whole year of these special habeas corpus. We've done like 4 this month already. So it's about how do we adapt. It's also exhausting because we're also still trying to represent people. Pamela, I'm trying to watch the time. Pamela has 5 children. Her youngest was 3 weeks old. She has an order of removal because she missed a court hearing. She went the day after because she got the date confused. It was probably like March 2nd and she thought it was February 3rd, you know, who knows? And 8 ICE vehicles showed up at her house like 2 weeks ago. This woman who had just given birth with 5 children, and she literally walked out and was like, did I murder someone? Like, why are you guys showing up with this sign of force, you know? And so now we're trying to make sure that Pamela doesn't get deported. Again, not somebody who just came in, which is what we used to be working with, but somebody who's been here for years. Who was trafficked, by the way, to get here and has been here for years. And I think just other like examples, one woman's been trying for 13 years to get her green card and got bad advice. And now she's just been like waiting for the process to go forward. But in the meantime, with the current climate, she's at risk of deportation, even though she's lived here since she was like 8 years old. And so it's also, and this is where we count on people like you, but it's also the fact that I'm not just legally trying to represent Maria. I'm recognizing that she needs a lot of support because she has to live with that every day. She does, her family does, her kids every day have to live with wondering if she's going to get all the way to the green card before she ends up back in Mexico, you know. And then one more, and then I want to talk a little bit more of this and then go into trafficking, but one more example of kind of today is this woman came, used a CBP1 app, entered the United States, asked for asylum, and then her youngest daughter was 17, and her youngest daughter 17 is 17 no matter what country you live in. So when they had to flee the country, because of safety issues, her younger daughter was with her boyfriend and she said, I'm fine, he'll protect me, I'm not coming. And so she said, well, please, please, please. And she finally had to say, I can't, my grandchildren, my other daughter, my husband, we have to go. And her daughter insisted, I'm safe. So they left. And things went south for the 17-year-old and she had to flee a violent relationship. So she came north, and on her way north in El Salvador, they asked her for an ID, and when she showed them the ID, they saw that she was a minor, and they put her in protective shelter and told her she couldn't leave without one of her parents physically coming to get her out. And so the mother faced a decision, right? Do I stay here because I have an asylum claim, or do I go get my daughter? And so she left the country and went and got her daughter. She said, basically, I did what any mom would do. I got my daughter safe. And then when she came back, she couldn't get back in the country and she was stuck in Juarez for about a year trying to get back in the country.
So 17 is a minor, isn't it?
So she was a minor, which is why El Salvador said they wouldn't release her without a parent showing up to protect her. So that her mom had to go to El Salvador. They're not from there, so that's the one thing that could potentially save her asylum claim is they're not actually from El Salvador, so she didn't go back to her country. But she had to go there, and then when she got back to Juarez, she couldn't get back in the country. So just like the decisions that people have to make, I think. And it's just to kind of, I just wanted to put that out there. And I mean, I would open that up to anybody else afterwards who wants to share like how your work or your world has changed as the rules keep changing every day, right? And how we have to keep adapting, you know? And it just right now also feels like everything is urgent, you know, because everybody lives in that space of like, I could be deported tomorrow. So everything we do, we try to do as quickly as we can to protect people. Does anybody have, or do you want to, let me stop then, because I was going to go to trafficking. Does anybody have anything you want to ask or add to that question of local?
Have you, as America's dad, been hassled?
So that probably is too political a question.
Okay, you don't want
Well, I would say personally, no, but there are, you know, there are different things going on in the state of Texas that complicate things and how we need to be careful of what we do and what we say. And, you know, if somebody works late, we basically always say two people have to leave together. Nobody can leave alone, things like that. Did you want to say something? She said, please repeat the question because people online can't hear it. And I was like, well, if I forget to do that, just wave at me. So Annabelle just waved at me and I was like, hi. The question, sorry, for those of you online, the question was whether at Las Americas, we have been hassled. And so I gave kind of an evasive response. But does anybody else who's here want to kind of throw out how you've seen that your work has had to change because of as things change? Or does your work not change, for instance, Maria? And I'll just repeat what you say.
Well, it's changing that we are seeing fewer people. The situation with this woman, we have to work with her.
That's right, we worked with you all. Let me just, so Maria from JRS is saying that their work has changed also because they're seeing fewer people. And the woman that I was just talking about who had to go get her daughter, JRS also worked with her a lot on the Juarez side. All right, I'll keep going. So breathe, because I'm gonna like turn the page. And I just want to talk a little bit about the other area that I work with a lot. I work on a team at Las Americas We call ourselves the Survivors Program. We used to be called the Crime Victims Program, but we've changed that and we're the Survivors Program. And we work with people who are survivors of either domestic violence or human trafficking or certain crimes. And so one of the things that we're trying to work with really hard is saying there's human trafficking that the United States government defines for people that might qualify for a special visa, called a T visa, a trafficking visa. But there's also an understanding of human trafficking that's much bigger. In our understanding of human trafficking, my notes, our understanding of human trafficking, when you think of human trafficking, at least before I started working with immigration, I thought of who? I thought of like runaway teenagers, right? Maybe I thought of people at like nail salons or people that work in restaurants or farm workers, as you said. And so we're really trying to stretch that to say, what is human trafficking and how is it different in a migrant population? So this is the UN definition of human trafficking: the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, of the abuse of a position of vulnerability, or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to, I'll simplify this, but to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. That's like the big UN definition. And then they go on to give examples of what that exploitation might be, right? Exploitation at a minimum shall include exploitation of prostitution of others, other forms of exploitation like forced labor or services, slavery, practices similar to slavery, servitude, the removal of organs, forced marriage. A really simple way to think about this, like what we would say is there's an act, and that might be the recruitment, the transportation, the harboring in a house. Like you don't have to actually move people for it to be trafficking. And then by using some kind of power or threat or coercion, right? Might be a physical threat. It might be a threat of like, we're going to call immigration on you. It might be a threat against your family, some kind of threat for the purpose of an end that is exploitation. Kind of the big picture. The part that is in green is because the United States definition is much more restricted. The US is very specific. It's the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring by force, fraud, or coercion. Has to be one of them. So I personally love the UN definition of abuse of a situation of power or vulnerability, because I think a lot of people are victimized by somebody recognizing that you have a great need right now, or that you're vulnerable. Maybe that I happen to know that you have a really sick person in your family and you desperately need money, that you can't go back to your country of origin. Any of those things that make a person vulnerable are really easy to exploit. That's not in the US definition. We talk about that, but it has to be force, fraud, or coercion. And coercion is like threats. It's not like, come on, I'll give you 2 ice cream cones instead of 1. It has to be like threat, right? And then the other thing is that for the US, it has to be commercial sex or forced labor. So like stealing organs, selling children, forced marriage, none of that fits the US definition unless you can fit that into commercial sex or forced labor. And commercial sex really just means that there was something of value exchanged, right? So people will talk about people getting maybe raped in the desert or on their way in, and that's a crime. It's not necessarily trafficking.
My understanding was that if you were a minor, that it was a little bit simpler, that you just were taken and it didn't matter.
If you're a minor, you don't necessarily have to prove the coercion. You still have to prove the other parts. And for the visa, to get a special visa for a survivor of human trafficking, there's all these other requirements. You have to be willing to cooperate with law enforcement. Minors don't have to do that. So this is like a broad, this is the complicated definition of human trafficking, right? And then, well, let me just go back to that for a sec. So I think I did this, hang on. No. Oh. Which one do you guys like better? So a couple of the things that really matter, especially when you consider migrants, is for human trafficking, consent doesn't matter. Now, the UN explicitly says consent doesn't matter. The US does not, but the US also doesn't say that it does matter. So we're going to constantly point out how it shouldn't matter. Why? Because a lot of people leave home and they might pay somebody, right, to get them to the border. They might pay a coyote or a guide or someone to get them to the border or across the border. They might be walking in situations that make them vulnerable to trafficking. And at some point, the situation may change, right? So when they left home, it was one thing. And at some point, if the situation changes and they lose the power to make a choice, then we're moving into trafficking land, right? So the project in Brazil that Elvira made reference to is with women who go to Brazil and then get tricked into having to carry drugs out of Brazil. They get arrested as international drug traffickers. Some of them are in really desperate situations. And so they're like, I really need money. I'll do that. And then they get to Brazil and they say, I don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to take the risk. I think it's a bad idea. I don't want to do that. And then the trafficker says, okay, well, you owe me $5,000 because I put money into this, or I know where your family lives. And then she ends up doing it. And so that's, for me, that's kind of a perfect example of when consent doesn't or shouldn't matter, because she might have chosen to come to Brazil, but that isn't the crime, right? So at the point when she says no and has no way to back out, that's when it becomes trafficking, because she's been coerced, she's been recruited, she's been coerced, and then she's forced to do something. Now, that happens at our border too, and the forced labor might be you're carrying a backpack of drugs across the border, right? Because it has to have that element of forced labor or commercial sex. Otherwise, again, it's a crime. It's not trafficking. So let me, oh, I'm already here.
Just carry the drugs, it's still trafficking.
They,
Because she said no.
human trafficking. They're drug trafficking, her human trafficking. Right, so, well, now I'm gonna do what I'm doing with you guys tomorrow morning, but let's say that the person who she paid to get to the border or to get to the US, she gets to the border and that person says, I'll charge you $2,000 less if you carry this backpack into the US. Not trafficking. It's like making a deal, right? It's a contract. It's like, I'll give you a discount unless there's a reason that she can't say no, right? So she's like, okay. So there was an offer. I don't even remember much from law school, but there was an offer. She accepted it. They made a deal and she goes forward. That's just part of a business arrangement in a way. There's consent. If that person says, I need you to carry this backpack across the border, and she says no, and that person says, the trafficker says, well, you are carrying this backpack across the border and you can't go back home because I know where you live and then that's not her consent, right? Then she's carrying a backpack and we're going to call that forced labor. It may be a backpack full of flowers, right? But if she doesn't choose to carry the backpack across the border, she's being forced to do something. So a lot of times the people that we're working with may start off on a journey with one intent or thinking one thing's going to happen and something else happens. One of the things that the UN says is that people generally self-identify. There's not lots of screening or people that are identifying, oh, you might be a victim of trafficking. So mostly people are going to get help as victims of human trafficking or survivors because they ask for help. And so if I'm coming north and everybody's told me it's a horrible trip and some horrible things happen to me, it's really easy for me to think, well, these are just the consequences of what I chose to do, right? And for me not to recognize that that power got taken out of my hands, or I didn't choose, I didn't consent. And so very likely, there's no numbers on this, of course, but there's a lot more people than we know who found themselves in that situation and didn't identify it as that, identified it as bad luck, consequences, normal for the choices I made, you know. And then the one other thing is just because so many people suffer exploitation, suffer kidnapping in Mexico, in situations similar to that, people have an understanding that that is also trafficking, right? I got kidnapped. My family had to pay. I was held for extortion. Not trafficking because there's no commercial sex or forced labor. It's a crime, right? But it's not human trafficking. It's a terrible thing, should never happen. But we are not going to be able to make an argument that that's human trafficking. So there's some really good data that kind of separates out what is the difference then, right? So human trafficking, the focus is that a person has been exploited. In human smuggling, it's about helping somebody enter a country without permission. Human trafficking uses recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, and then uses force, fraud, or coercion to move that person to do what you want them to do. Human smuggling is an arrangement between two people to enter a country without permission, again, right? The purpose of human trafficking is exploitation. That person is always the one that loses, right? There might be money. They're not the ones that are going to see it. So if you think of it, it's exploitation of that person. Human smuggling, the purpose is to help the person enter the country. I should start changing illegal from this thing I copied from the UN. But in effect, the end goal, both parties are getting out of it what they wanted or what they agreed to get out of it, right? In human trafficking, one party's benefiting, one party isn't. Consent is irrelevant. Consent is usually involved. So go ahead.
Yeah, it's a question. Human trafficking, the person who did the trafficking is criminalized, right? It's a crime.
Yes.
What about the person who was trafficked?
They should not be.
When they are found at the border, they were trafficked. Are they also detained or they reported? What happens to that person who was trafficked into the country?
What should happen is the US actually has a specific visa called a T visa for victims or survivors of human trafficking. And I like to say it's from a more generous time in our country's history. And the T visa recognizes that if a person is put in this situation, not by their own will, that they should not be criminalized, right? And so the T visa says, there's lots of reasons for it. One is because we say, like, this shouldn't happen to people, right? This shouldn't happen. This shouldn't happen in this country. Also, because the government said, we don't want people who commit these types of crimes to think, well, I'll just go commit this crime against a migrant because they can't do anything, right? So we want the people, the traffickers, to know that they can't do this to anybody. We also want the victims or the survivors not to be afraid to go to the police, right? Because if you are afraid to go to the police because you suffered a crime, because you think you're going to be deported, you're not going to report it. And then lastly, if in fact, these are actually, they call them law enforcement tools. If in fact they're able to catch the trafficker and want to hold that person to justice, they're going to need the victim to testify likely, right? So they need them to be in this country. So all of that was kind of the rationale behind this type of visa. And if you qualify, if you fit the requirements, you can get what's called a T visa, and it gives you 3 years, 4 years. And then at the end of that, you can apply for a green card. You still have to apply and, you know, I mean, you're not going to get rejected unless things have happened in the interim that make you inadmissible or not a good character. So the idea is if you suffered human trafficking inside this country or coming into this country, it doesn't work if you suffered it in Mexico and it didn't happen in coming into the US, then you can actually get lawful status in the country.
When I was at Catholic Charities, there was a big movement in the country try to raise awareness about human trafficking and educate people and to, you know, bring those individuals forward out of the shadows. Do you know, under this administration, has all of that also gone dark, or do we know, anyone have knowledge of what's happening with the human trafficking?
I've not heard anything. I think that was one of this administration's excuses for clamping down on some of the immigration things, because they were saying, we're going to reduce human trafficking by making immigration harder, which seems counterintuitive to me. Because I think what will happen is, as I think Alan said, what will happen is, as it's harder and harder to come, if you still can't go back to your home country, and you still feel strongly that you need to get into the US for family reunification or whatever, then you're going to have to find other more dangerous ways to get in, and you'll increase your level of vulnerability. You can only have one slide left.
So as of today, is the T visa still available?
It is, and some of those visas are actually statutory. So they can narrow them, like asylum is a law, but they can't get rid of asylum, but what they can do is they can keep narrowing who qualifies, you know? So you can't get rid of the T visa or the U visa, which is for victims of crime, or the visa VAWA for victims of domestic violence, but you could try to keep kind of restricting how people qualify, or there's a lot of discretion, right? We fill out the whole application, we make a whole argument. There's a fair amount of discretion, so you can limit it in those ways. You can slow down the process of approval. The U visa, which is for victims of crime, is running about 5 years right now. The T visa is running 1.5 years. So you could also just keep slowing that down. So lastly, hope and resilience. I have more resilience than hope right now, but so I was just thinking about like choices that we have to make, like do something to keep reminding yourself that there's hope and there's resilience, right? I became vegetarian on January 20th because I was like, I need something to remind me every single day to resist. So I think it must have gotten dusty. Oh, until 5. For those of you online, it's because everybody's phone is going off because we're getting weather alerts. Dust storm warnings. So like do things to remind yourself to resist and to remind yourself that people are resisting, right? And my other campaign that I'm starting is I'm gonna get a tattoo, and I'm gonna start a movement for all of us to get a yellow flower tattoo, because it'll constantly remind us that we're not alone and that we're all resisting. And then when we all get arrested for being part of the yellow flower gang, I'll be very proud of that. Join the we world. This is not about me, right? This isn't about my country. It's not about me. This is about us. Be creative, be inspired by people, be inspiring to people. Honestly, I think one of the things that does give me hope and resilience are young people. that are still like being active, being committed, working for change. The fact that all of you are here today gives me hope. Be part of a team. I was just like, and believe, right? This is a yellow poppy. You'll be seeing that in my tattoo movement.
Flower power.
Flower power, there you go. Well, first I was gonna suggest shaving our heads and putting a peace sign, but that didn't go over. So I've moved on. I think that's it. I have one more slide that is just my contact info. There you go. Yes.